Today, we will be discussing 5 books, 3 of which are by the American author Jeffrey Eugenides. We'll also be discussing nostalgia, which I believe to be the central pillar around which he has built his body of work. Then at the end, we'll do a nice little wrap-up, and maybe you'll have learned something, including maybe the sheer, unadulterated joy of never being able to get over your first love affair. It's 2018. It's also 1:30 in the morning, and you should be asleep. After all, you have an early morning the next day. You are not asleep. You are wide awake. And like the little bitch you are listening to Supercut by Lorde on repeat, for reasons which I do not think I need to explain. The word nostalgia gets tossed around so frequently nowadays that frequently I feel like I forget what the word actually means. We are all now by this point used to our favorite childhood intellectual properties, sequels, prequels, reimaginings, repackagings being sold to us, promising a return to happier, better, old times, but what does it actually mean to be nostalgic?
To understand that, we have to understand a nostalgia's history, and the history of an emotion is a strange, nebulous thing. The first book I read for this video, and my source for a lot of the historical information about nostalgia that I'll present to you, was Nostalgia, A History of a Dangerous Emotion by Agnes Arnold-Forster. What I came away with after reading it was an impression of evolution. Nostalgia has changed tremendously over the years. The word nostalgia has Greek origins. Nosto meaning home and algos meaning pain were portmanteaued together into literally pain for home. Now, although nostalgia has changed, that same basic principle still holds true. Nostalgia is a remembrance of and a yearning for something someone has lost. Now, the word itself having Greek roots is interesting, specifically when talking about the Eugenides connection, because he is also of Greek descent, and will literally not stop writing about it. More on that later, though. Nostalgia first emerges in the 16th century, not as an emotion or what the Disney Corporation is trying to sell you, but as a legitimate and a serious medical condition. In fact, an illness is what nostalgia has spent most of its history as. It begins as an affliction which really affected only the Swiss, who became devastatingly ill upon leaving their homes in the Alps and descending into the claustrophobic hellscape of just pre-industrial Europe. These people, who were mostly European mercenaries, became lethargic and depressed. Some even refused to eat and drink. They just sat there, laid there, wasting away because they missed home. So here comes a point where I have to emphasize something. People were diagnosed with nostalgia, okay? In some circumstances, they were even said to die of it. They didn't go seeking out nostalgia on AI-curated Spotify playlists. In fact, they didn't go seeking it out at all. Nostalgia is something that's commonly cited as a cause of death, often in some pretty grim circumstances, such as the transatlantic slave trade, where nostalgia was sometimes cited by doctors aboard slave boats as the reason that kidnapped Africans leapt overboard to their deaths in the ocean. Of the many millions of enslaved people shipped across the Atlantic, a significant number died from nostalgia. Locked in each other's arms, they leapt overboard into the ocean. The ship's doctor claimed that they hoped, once their spirits had been released from their bodies, they could return home. People would continue to die from nostalgia for a long period of time, including up to and after the American Civil War, wherein a grand total of 2,588 men were diagnosed with it, some of them dying. Now, to be clear, wanting movies to be like they were when you were a kid did not kill these soldiers. It was simply the best answer available to the doctors at the time for what ailed these men, and it's representative of most of the early history of nostalgia. For most of its existence, nostalgia was an illness, and this perception only begins to soften after the turn of the century, when immigration began to explode as war in Europe escalated. Immigrants to the United States yearned for home, which was increasingly seen as a natural, even benevolent impulse, a recalling of, simple, pure, benevolent things like Folgers coffee. God damn, that incest coffee tastes good. Arnold-Forster writes that nostalgia is a malleable emotion. Nothing could be more true, considering the radical shift nostalgia would undergo over the 20th century. It would be rehabilitated, shifting from a disease into, eventually, a marketing tactic. The gradual softening of nostalgia really began to be exploited by marketing executives in the 1970s, a decade which came to be known in America as the second-hand 70s, due to the wave of nostalgia which swept the nation. It becomes really easy to sell someone something when that something can be made a part of their history. Now, the wave of nostalgia which peaked in the 1970s had been building for a while, but it really hit its zenith in that decade. These days, Newsweek reported in 1970, nostalgia is big business. And although our idea of nostalgia has evolved somewhat since then, in large part our modern understanding of it is informed by its usefulness as a sales tactic. Just look at Star Wars, right? It's a property nowadays that we're all super quote-unquote nostalgic about, but even when were first released in 1977, it harkened back to an earlier age of science fiction serials like Flash Gordon. Nostalgia played a huge part in that franchise being successful in the first place. And so, nostalgia has melted. From a cause of death in its early existence to a feeling you get now while watching old movies. Now, what remains true of nostalgia across all of its existence is that it is a reaction. We understand that better than ever now. Nostalgia can be used as a tool to create a sense of meaning and purpose. It is, therefore, a kind of emotional armor. Now, whether it's thought of as an illness or as a way to increase your likelihood to purchase a product, nostalgia is something that happens in the body and or in the mind as a reaction to change. And going forward, a reaction to change in the body and mind, is what I'll be referring to when I say the word nostalgia.
Jeffrey Eugenides is an author. He has to date published 3 novels and a collection of short stories. Now, just to be clear, I have read everything that he's taken the trouble to bind into a volume, but we are going to be focusing on the novels for this video, mostly because the short stories in Fresh Complaint here are mostly not that interesting, or they've been reworked into the novels that we will be talking about.
He was born in Detroit in 1960, 10 years prior to the nostalgia boom in America. Detroit is the major setting across Eugenides' work. The Virgin Suicides takes place entirely in suburbs close to Detroit, and the majority of Middlesex takes place in these suburbs or in Detroit proper as well. Additionally, characters from the marriage plot are from Detroit, and this is the beginning of the nostalgia connection. In an interview, Eugenides was quoted as saying this: "My entire childhood coincided with the demise of Detroit. I grew up watching houses and buildings fall apart and then disappear. It imbued my sense of the world with a strong elegiac quality, a direct experience of the fragility and evanescence of the material world." This deep connection with home forms the basis of Eugenides' work. This bygone Detroit and its suburbs, namely the suburb of Grosse Pointe, are as much of a character as any of the people populating Eugenides' novels. Now, the events Eugenides most closely associates with Detroit are the race riots of 1967. You do not need to understand everything about these race riots to understand Eugenides' work, although learning history is always fun and cool. But I will briefly say that the riots, which were caused by racism, both systemic and personal, serve as an interesting inflection point in Eugenides' relationship with nostalgia. Nostalgia tends to imply the way things were kind of deal. Eugenides, at the time the riots took place, would have been 7 years old. This is a pretty early time in a person's life for their established view of the world to be challenged, but it is also in keeping with something we know about nostalgia, which is that one does not need to have actually experienced something to be nostalgic for it. My evidence for this statement is all those guys out there who won't shut the fuck up about the Roman Empire.
Now, Eugenides is not at all interested in the Roman Empire. Mainly, he is interested in Detroit, first loves, and Greece.
Eugenides' experience with these things left a major imprint on him, which he continually explores in his work. A major plot point in Middlesex is white flight, white people fleeing Detroit because black people happen to live there too. This is the reason the narrator's family moves away from Detroit and out to the suburbs. Cal's father, Milton, packs the family up and moves them to Grosse Pointe after the race riots. Now, Milton, he is a fascinating character. He's also a racist and a conservative voter.
But I repeat myself.
White flight moves Cal from the city to the suburbs, that old bastion of safety and nostalgia. It moves Cal to the house known as Middlesex, whose name has no symbolic meaning at all. It is here, in Grosse Pointe, the town of Eugenides' childhood, that his characters find their first loves, where the unnamed narrators of the Virgin Suicides fall for the Lisbon sisters. It is a witch's brew of romantic nostalgia, historical nostalgia, and the good old-fashioned longing for home that nostalgia is at its most basic level. Speaking of different types of nostalgia. Nostalgia can be broken down into a bevy of different subsets. Arnold-Forster, in her history, outlines a difference between historical and personal nostalgia, differentiating between nostalgia for something someone never experienced versus a nostalgia for a lost period, place, or person in one's life.
You know, I was perfectly all right with using personal and historical nostalgia as the foundational building blocks for this video. Totally all right, had no issues whatsoever. Then I read Svetlana Boym. You see, Svetlana Boym wrote this book here. It's called The Future of Nostalgia, and it is one of the most intelligently written books I have ever read. As such, I only really understood about half of it. It's an amalgamation of many different things, drawing on memory, lived experience, cultural studies, poetry, literature, among many other forms in order to paint a comprehensive picture of what nostalgia actually is and how it manifests in the real world.
Boym outlines two primary types of nostalgia, restorative and reflective. To really dumb this down, restorative nostalgia is driven by a desire to rebuild a lost home, while reflective nostalgia is defined more by longing for people, places, and times long gone by. In order to back up her argument, she spends a lot of time in Eastern Europe talking about different cities and how nostalgia is interwoven through their histories. Now, although I love a good jaunt through the Balkans as much as your average video essayist, as far as I can tell, Eugenides has taken no official position on the Yugoslav wars. Even though, sidebar, the Virgin Suicides was banned in Belarus earlier this year.
Now, while Eugenides' silence on Lukashenko's move is cowardice, plain and simple, it means we are unfortunately going to have to leave Eastern Europe for now. We are going to divert and we are going to return across the ocean to the suburbs of Detroit, which is home not only to Eugenides and his childhood, but to a fucking boatload of suicidal teenage girls as well.
Eugenides' first published novel, The Virgin Suicides, is also likely still his best known. This is in no small part due to the film adaptation, which was Sofia Coppola's debut movie, and her first collaboration with Kirsten Dunst. Yes, this is truly a film for the girls. The book, though? That's for the boys. The novel spends a year in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and oh boy, what a rollicking year it is! Over this period of time, an entire minivan's worth of sisters, the Lisbons, kill themselves, for a reason which are left unclear. The novel is a flashback, narrated in the collective first person by a group of boys who are obsessed with the Lisbon girls. The boys now are middle-aged men, and they recount the story to each other as they cross paths, get fat, and go bald. The narration is key to the success of the novel for a few reasons, one of which is the flashback framework. The boys, now men, are unable to move past their past. They recount events from 20, maybe 30 years ago, still obsessed with these elusive perfect girls, who will always be better in their minds than the women that they married. Women who, unfortunately, have to continue to exist as real people. The Virgin Suicides is a novel that alternates between a dreamlike state of remembrance and the brutal loss of innocence. A hugely important contrast is drawn between memories of the girls and of the actual physical evidence of how they lived, photographs, medical records, and the like. One of these memories is of a party, where the boys break into a liquor cabinet and they just kind of get plastered. Once they're all drunk and all loosened up, one of them puts on lipstick, which was stolen from Lux, the promiscuous Lisbon daughter. And then they spend the rest of the night drinking and making out with each other just to get a taste of Lux on the lips of their friend. Now, I don't know why they cut that from the movie. I can't imagine why Sophia cut that. This visceral nostalgic haze, like the haze at the party, is so unreal it supplants the boys' reality as they age. They gather items owned by or associated with the Lisbon sisters and store them in suitcases in an old treehouse, reconvening in there for more conversations, more attempts to understand why the girls took their own lives. A story which the boys know they will never solve, but pursue anyway, despite the futility of the exercise. These meetings upset the boys' own memories, and they blend themselves in with the girls, who they did not know well in real life. We came to hold collective memories of things we hadn't experienced, say the narrators. Swap a few words out, and this sentence could just as easily have come from either Arnold-Forster or Boym's books on nostalgia, rather than Eugenides' work of fiction. And there are times, quite frankly, when I've forgotten that Eugenides' work is fictional, such as the skill he's able to wield when bringing to life the characters who populate his novels. Speaking of forgetting, Boym writes that forgetting is essential to nostalgia. One must forget to create false memories. And false memories, or falsified memories, are essentially what nostalgia is. Time has separated the narrators of the Virgin Suicides from their childhoods and their innocence, which they desperately try to reclaim by examining knickknacks and old photographs of the girls who they continue to see in dreams as they themselves turn into old men. The boys themselves don't even really remember the Lisbon girls anymore. It's been too long. I mean, they remember some things about Lux, but the sisters as a whole tend to meld into one organism, a lithe, cat-like creature the color of the sunset that represents everything right with their youths. In a word, nostalgia.
Now, it is at this point that some of my viewers, thank you, might very well be asking themselves a perfectly reasonable question. What the fuck is nostalgic about teenage girls killing themselves? And you know what? I'm going to answer that question. But to answer it, we're going to have to go back to Svetlana Boym and to Berlin. We're going to talk about a little man. The Ampelmann, sometimes known as the Ampelmannchen, is a traffic light symbol. That's all he is. He's a little German man, turns green when it's time to go and red when it's time to stop. Notably, he never turns yellow because, well, those Germans, they have no cultural understanding of what it means to slow down.
This little man wore a hat, and he was on many stoplights in East Berlin. Then reunification rolled around, and they tore down the Berlin Wall, and they got rid of the Ampelmann. Him and his little hat, well, they weren't standardized enough, you see. You've got to standardize things as you boldly go forward into the future. It's how... Instead, they returned to boring old stoplights, and people were furious.
I mean, can you really blame them? Who doesn't need a little Ein bisschen Deutschermann in their lives? You know, that Ampelmann, he has a way of finding his way into your heart.
Ampelmann was missed so badly he was eventually brought back, and he remains a part of German, specifically East German culture to this day, adorning many stoplights and streetlights, although, unfortunately, he has gone woke. The important thing to note here is that people didn't actually miss a traffic light. What they missed was what the Ampelmann represented, the positive aspects of life east of the Berlin Wall that had vanished when it came time to tear the wall down. People projected their nostalgia for a home and a political system that had been forever altered and lost onto this most mundane of things, this light that tells you when it is okay to go.
The boys in the Virgin Suicides aren't nostalgic for all of their neighbors killing themselves. They're nostalgic for the people they were before the suicides happened. You know, they were nostalgic for a time period when it seemed feasible that they could grow to love the Lisbon sisters, and that, in turn, the Lisbon sisters could grow to love them in a way that's not perverse or voyeuristic. It's a kind of reflective nostalgia, a nostalgia that Eugenides toys around with in this novel, developing it a little bit before really going bonkers with it in his next novel, Middlesex.
Middlesex was the first novel by Eugenides that I read, and to this day it remains my favorite. It is the story of the Stephanides family told over 3 generations by the omniscient Cal Stephanides, their prodigal son. Cal is also intersex. This is because of some low-key, freaky incest shit that his ancestors partake in. For what it's worth, I think Eugenides' portrayal of an intersex person is pretty good. It seems empathetic, and Cal is a well-rounded and intriguing character. I, however, am not intersex. Luckily for me, there, in this world, exist intersex individuals who have taken time to write more extended critical examinations of Eugenides' depiction of intersexuality. Some are positive, some are negative, and if you're more interested in reading the novel and about the novel through that lens specifically, I'd recommend searching those pieces out. For now, though, we're going to continue from a nostalgia angle. I am of the opinion that Middlesex succeeds as a family saga and as a coming-of-age story, but it's not a book without flaws. It's also the book which has the most developed relationship with nostalgia out of any of Eugenides' works, at least upon first examination. The book shifts its focus between multiple different protagonists, but its narrator is Cal Stephanides, born intersex and raised as a girl until around the age of 14, when he discovers he's intersex and chooses to live as a man. Now, how does the family saga come into play in all of this?
Well, Cal observes his family history from the weird void that we all float around in before we're conceived, and he relays it to us up until the point when he's born. Then the story transforms, becoming a coming-of-age story, a story of self-discovery, and a story of young love.
The family saga begins with Cal's grandparents, who flee their home in Asia Minor due to the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922.
On the boat over from America, they start fucking!
From there, they land in New York before settling in Detroit, and Desdemona, Cal's grandfather, begins working with the Nation of Islam.
Yeah, that's right, folks. There's an entire chapter in this book solely dedicated to Yakub. So for all my tricknology heads out there, there's a little something in here for you too, don't worry. You know, every day I wake up, and I thank Yakub for creating the white race, that I might be born, create self-indulgent video essays, and disappoint my parents.
Cal's parents are born, they live for a while, and then they bring Cal into the world, naming him Calliope at birth. They then move out of Detroit proper and into Grosse Pointe, where Cal's story takes over the novel. This story, for many, many pages, is defined by Cal's relationship with two types of love: love for the self and romantic love. This next bit relies pretty heavily on understanding that being nostalgic for past relationships is something that exists. If you don't get that, good for you, because it fucking sucks. Anyway, a classmate of Cal's is his first and most enduring love affair, and the one that comes to really define the back half of Middlesex. She's first identified when Cal still presents as feminine, and the memory of this first love is so present and so painful, perhaps because of its ties to that time, that Cal cannot refer to her by her name. Cal calls his first love the obscure object for the duration of the book. Her arrival into the novel is almost biblical, with beams of light falling through the object's hair as Cal describes this, his most intense love. The object is described in terms of almost pure affection, where her negative attributes don't matter at all. They pale in comparison to the golden beam of sun she lazily slinks around in.
Sidebar, both the obscure object and Lux Lisbon are described as being heavy cigarette smokers. I really can't understate how big of a deal this is with these. It's constant with these two, right? They feel like prepubescent George Harrisons. And hey, get the fuck out of here! Go! Shoot!
Even as an adult, Cal experiences a painful nostalgia for the object. The writing Eugenides does about the object and Cal's feelings for her is some of his best, and this is for two main reasons. The first is his strength as a character writer. It's his most evident skill as an author. He has a real knack for giving characters color, whether that be with descriptions of their actions or any number of other details about their person. And he needs to be great with these descriptions for Middlesex to work at all, given how, as a family saga, new characters are constantly being introduced, and they need to be interesting to keep the reader reading. The second thing that Eugenides is really, really good at is little details. Now, I'm not sure what literary term works best to describe these things, but all three of his novels are full of them. Sights caught out of the corner of your eye, the faint whiff of a neighbor barbecuing in their backyard, the exact sound the wind made when it caressed the branches of the tree outside the house you grew up in. These things are all over Eugenides' novels, and when these sensory details combine with Eugenides' character writing, it creates a powerful sense of reflective nostalgia, a longing for the places and people that have been left behind with the passage of time. In The Future of Nostalgia, Boym writes, "Reflective nostalgia is more concerned with historical and individual time, with the irrevocability of the past and human finitude. One remembers best what is colored by emotion. Moreover, in the emotional topography of memory, personal and historical events tend to be conflated." It is this reflective nostalgia that defines Eugenides' first two novels. The Decline of Detroit, The Suicides of the Lisbons, Immigrating to America, Life in Grosse Pointe, Lux on the Football Field, Cal's first sexual experiences, they're all interwoven in Eugenides' eyes, part of a web that he's seen with the rose-tinted lenses of reflective nostalgia, the nostalgia which clearly defines his first two books.
But what about his third, and to date, most recently published novel? Well, folks, although I have been very kind to Jeffrey Eugenides about his work throughout this video, and I will continue to do so, I recommend that you strap in, because I have a fucking bone to pick with him on this one. When I started the reading and the research that I had to do for this video, I thought The Marriage Plot would be the easiest of Jeffrey Eugenides' books to write about. It is, after all, on its surface, pretty nostalgic. It is the story of a quasi-love triangle between three students just leading up to and after their graduation from university. Leonard Bankhead, Madeline Hanna, his fiancée, and Mitchell Grammaticus, who is convinced that Madeline will marry him despite her apparent disinterest in him.
The book begins with all three graduating from Brown University, where Eugenides himself went to college. The nostalgic influence here should be evident: remembrance of a place and people, an extension of the reflective nostalgia which has dominated Eugenides' previous works. Mitchell goes overseas on a Europe trip, while Leonard and Madeline move in together in Cape Cod, where Leonard occupies himself with postgraduate work, and Madeline just kind of cares for him and thinks about literature. The characters occupy a kind of idealized post-college world. None of them really know for sure who they are yet, or what they will do with their lives, and none of them ever really have to care about money. Romance and its complications occupy their days. In this way, older novels like those of Jane Austen are echoed. The novel purports to be an updating of classic novels whose plots center around marriage.
So there it is, right? Boom. Wash your hands. It's quick and easy and it's done with. Nostalgia for youth, nostalgia for college, nostalgia for the freedom of being a child emotionally without having your parents' watchful eyes all over you, and nostalgia for the rush that you're overcome with when every second of being in love feels like the most important thing that you will ever experience. In one of Mitchell's chapters, college is even described as the last period of total freedom in their lives. So it's bound to be a nostalgic read. I mean, it's evident. It's on its face, right? The book is titled The Marriage Plot. It's pretty easy. I almost felt like I didn't have to reread it. Well, then I did, and to be completely honest with all of you, it was kind of a bizarre experience, and it screwed with my head a little bit because this book does not at all read how I remember it reading. In fact, it's frankly bizarre how out of whack this novel is with the rest of Jeffrey Eugenides' bibliography.
The novel is written in the third-person limited voice. For the bulk of the book, we're following Mitchell or Madeline, and when we're following them, we're unaware of what the other is doing. This helps to keep a kind of suspense going, especially when we follow Mitchell as he thinks of Madeline far more often than she thinks about him.
You may have noticed I didn't mention the book following Leonard, and we'll get to that soon, I promise.
The first thing you might notice if you were to read The Marriage Plot after watching this video is that it can appear strikingly anti-nostalgic. Although it frequently recounts the past of its characters, it can often feel like the novel has an active disdain for the past. Madeline almost never looks to her personal past with any fondness or concern. She's mainly occupied with her life with Leonard and the challenges they will face as a couple as they move into the future together. Leonard had an emotionally abusive childhood, and his past is recounted with bitterness when it is addressed. In fact, the only really nostalgic character is Mitchell, who often finds himself going over his previous interactions with Madeline to find hope that she might one day love him. Mitchell is also experiencing a religious crisis, a crisis he is attempting to solve by reading the works of religious figures who have been dead for centuries. This is not an inherently nostalgic thing to do, but this preoccupation with the past is indicative of Mitchell's character.
Okay, so what we have talked about so far in regards to this book, it's all textual. It's stuff that's in the pages, right? And you can make a concrete argument about that stuff without really needing to know any outside information about the book or the inspirations behind it. But the reasons behind my personal, let's call it, agitation over this book, they're intertextual. It's stuff outside the book, right? So I'm going to need to go outside the book and give you some outside information on it briefly to get you up to speed, but just please bear with me on this one because I need to get this off my chest.
Mitchell Grammaticus, the true protagonist of the novel, is the author, Jeffrey Eugenides. The name itself is a pretty on-the-nose reference to James Joyce's Stephen Daedalus, but the character is based in large part on Eugenides himself. Both are from Detroit, both are of Greek descent, both went to India after they graduated college. Eugenides has been open about this, but he's claimed that although Mitchell has the most in common with himself on the surface, there are pieces of his personality that have found their way into Leonard and Madeline as well. This is not uncommon in writing. You have to get inspiration for your characters from somewhere. You draw on a lot of composite sources, and some of those sources might be yourself. Quentin Tarantino, for example, has never written a character which doesn't speak like himself, but he's won 2 Oscars for writing.
So, Mitchell's Eugenides. Fine, whatever. Cal, the narrator from Middlesex, also has a lot in common with his author. What's the big deal with any of that? Why is this sticking in my head so much? That is because of one of the inspiration points for another main character in The Marriage Plot, and the implications that has for the way Mitchell Grammaticus and Leonard Bankhead interact. Leonard Bankhead, Madeline's fiancé and then husband in The Marriage Plot, is clearly based in large part upon the author David Foster Wallace.
For those of you who don't know, David Foster Wallace, or DFW, was a pretty influential / widely known author who did a lot of important work, not just in the field of literature. He was also a pioneer in the world of white boys wearing bandanas.
That's right, folks. It's White Boy Winter, and we're gonna wear bandanas if we goddamned DFW and Leonard both wear bandanas. And yes, this is important. Other than bandana advocacy, David Foster Wallace is most famous for writing Infinite Jest, a book that pretty much at this point exclusively gives pretentious literature students something to carry around to signal to the rest of the world how unfuckable they are. Think poison dart frogs.
It's not that odd that an author might base a character in one of their works off of another author. Not odd at all. Especially when Foster Wallace was one of the last smart authors to receive outsized attention in popular culture. In fact, he's become something of an iconic figure. Surely, Eugenides would acknowledge the inspiration here, given how Foster Wallace is an easily identifiable figure in literary circles. Surely, he would do that, right? Shows what I know. Eugenides has insisted he did not base the character off of Wallace. Huh, one might say. Huh. And Eugenides, he would say, no, that character is not based off of David Foster Wallace. That character is based off of the Guns N' Roses fans who I went to school with. You know, those philosophically inclined, mentally ill, double-majoring, bandana-wearing Guns N' Roses fans who were obviously such a common stereotype at colleges across the United States from the late 1980s to the mid-1990s. As viewers of my Roberto Bolaño video will know, authors love to lie. If you're an author of fiction, it's literally your job just to make shit up. And you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to call Jeff out. Jeffrey Eugenides is lying about Leonard. You can lie to everyone else, Jeff, but you can't lie to me. It would be one thing if all Leonard had in common with Foster Wallace was the bandana. You could skate by with that and maybe get away with it. But the two also share a fondness for tobacco. Oh, wait a minute. What's that you say? Not enough evidence? Well, fine, my dear discerning astute viewers, but there's also all of this. Both were philosophy majors, both were mentally ill, both stopped taking their prescribed medications at one point, which led to negative personal consequences. Both are described as charismatic, both have a self-described interest in the passage of time, and fine. Maybe all of that is circumstantial. Fine, maybe all Guns N' Roses guys are brilliant men and women of philosophy who happen to wear bandanas. Okay. Maybe you believe Eugenides, who swears Foster Wallace wasn't the inspiration point. Then how, dear viewer, do you explain the lifting of dialogue for Leonard almost verbatim from a David Foster Wallace interview? How do you explain that away? Leonard is clearly based in large part off of David Foster Wallace. You cannot argue otherwise. You cannot. You can lie to the public, Jeff, but you can't lie to me. I've read everything you've written twice. So, okay, fine. We've established that Mitchell is based off Eugenides and Leonard off of Foster Wallace. This, again, is not unusual in and of itself, and characters can often grow and spin off into wild places from their inspiration points. But these characters are so close to their real-life counterparts that once you know where these characters come from, it recontextualizes the whole book. It leads one to wonder, who is Madeline? If Mitchell and Leonard are both based on authors, who is this woman that they're orbiting? Does she exist too, or is she more fully another side of Eugenides brought to life? It becomes really weird to try and answer, but never as weird as the way that Eugenides plays with his David Foster Wallace doll. Earlier I mentioned that the marriage plot, for the most part, follows Mitchell and Madeline. Leonard only receives one chapter, which follows his point of view in the entire book. He's a huge figure in the novel, in large part because Madeline's chapters focus mainly on him, which is a separate issue. But he only gets a chapter as the book prepares for its ascent into the climax. What Eugenides does with Leonard/Wallace in this chapter is, frankly, astonishing. Up until this point, Leonard is a mixed bag in terms of his moral character, but this is ascribed to his mental illness, the manic depression he suffers from. None of the main trio are angels, and none of them start out particularly likable either, so Leonard being a charismatic asshole fits in, and we feel for him when Madeline skips her college graduation to rush to his bedside in a mental hospital.
This is early on, though. This is before the Leonard chapter. Now, in this chapter, we see Leonard fucking with the dosage of his medication. He's trying to achieve a nirvana-like state of mania while erasing the depressive episodes that plague him. And remember, this is a character which is based in large part on an author who killed himself, which might have been partially due to changes in his antidepressive medication. In this chapter, there is a passage wherein Leonard, in the midst of a depressive episode, jerks off to the thought of Mitchell fucking Madeline. The image of Grammaticus screwing Madeline or of Madeline going down on him contained the right mixture of pain and arousal to stir Leonard from his deadened sexual state. To break the tedium of the hospital, he tortured himself with this twisted fantasy, jerking off in the bathroom stall while holding the lockless door closed with his free hand. Jeffrey Eugenides wrote and published a book wherein a character inspired by the author David Foster Wallace jerks off to the idea of Eugenides fucking his fiancée. My question's why? Why would you do that, Jeff?
I don't even care if you make fun of DFW. He's basically a punching bag at this point, and from my understanding, he was not that great of a guy in real life. So I don't want to sound like I'm caping for him, but why? Specifically, would you do this? Why, later in the same chapter, do you have Leonard sexually assault a 16-year-old girl? Unfortunately for me, I'm fucking obsessed with the why behind novels. This whole passage just messed with my head. I put the book down and I stared at the ceiling for a while after I read it. Why would you write this? Furthermore, why would you write this about someone who you didn't even really know? David Foster Wallace and Jeffrey Eugenides exchanged a letter or two, and they were maybe close to forming a deeper relationship before Wallace died. I mean, whatever the fuck that means, that's according to Jeff. But the fact remains that he published this. And no author, least of all someone as skilled as Jeffrey Eugenides, publishes a book without a reason.
I have been thinking about this shit for weeks. Man, for weeks. And the worst part is that I'll never really know why Eugenides did it. I'll never know. I mean, he has been pretty steadfast about denying that Foster Wallace was an inspiration point for Leonard. So, I guess that I should just let it go. Right? I'm not going to get an answer on this, or any satisfactory answer from the author himself, at least. So just let it disappear into the ether. Come closer. Closer. This is a video essay about nostalgia. I'm not letting go of shit.
I am going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to speak about people whose personal lives I do not know. But I do know their writing. I reread everything Eugenides wrote to write this video, so I feel like I've earned the right to present a crackpot literary theory. How did I go about figuring one out? The first place I went to try and solve this was Madeline. I thought if I could figure out who she was based on, because surely she must be based on someone, right? It would make the motivations behind the Leonard passage make sense. Unfortunately, the most information I could find led back to Eugenides lying about the inspiration for his characters. So, back to Leonard and Mitchell I went. And I thought about them, and I tried to figure out the reason Jeffrey Eugenides would write a book about their love for the same woman, and why he would write that book as a follow-up to Middlesex, which he won the fucking Pulitzer Prize for. And I did hit on something, so I'm going to present it here.
This is just personal conjecture, but I think, incredibly, that it does come back to Madeline. Both Mitchell and Leonard are in love with her, and so too are the inspiration points for their characters. Jeffrey Eugenides and David Foster Wallace are both in love with Madeline, not because she's representative of some real-life person, but rather because she is a stand-in for the concept of literature itself.
Just stay with me here. Madeline is an English major. It is stated in the novel that she became an English major simply because she loved to read. Everything about her life, from her childhood wallpaper to how she comforts herself when hitting rough patches with Leonard, is informed by literature. She's drawn to literature of the past, but feels pressured to move forward into her future. So too is literature in conflict with itself and where it should go. Should it embrace and perfect the novel as it has been for some 200-odd years, or should it look forward to a bold, new, at least at first, unintelligible future?
Why are Mitchell and Leonard fighting over Madeline? Well, it's because Eugenides and Foster Wallace have, or had, differing viewpoints on where literature should go. It is not a coincidence that the self-stated goal of Foster Wallace's most famous work, which I haven't read, was to move literature forward into new, murky, deeply ironic postmodern territory.
Eugenides, in contrast, is obsessed with the past. His novels are more about revisiting and updating the classic novels of yesterday, the coming-of-age story, the family saga, the constant name drops of classic authors in the marriage plot. I mean, these are things that Jeffrey Eugenides loves. Mitchell and Leonard are arguments. Mitchell for the classic novel, Leonard for the novel of the future. Madeline's attentions, focused on Leonard and the future for most of the novel, turn to Mitchell sporadically and most definitively at the end of the novel, when, after Leonard divorces her, she and Mitchell finally have sex.
Unsurprisingly, it's weird and it's not really satisfying.
Afterwards, Mitchell, who up until this point in the novel has been fantasizing about marrying Madeline, breaks down. He realizes that she will never love him the way he has idolized her, and this prompts, at long last, his emotional growth. And you realize Mitchell is the protagonist of the novel, not Madeline. After Mitchell dries his eyes, he climbs up to Madeline's room in her parents' house. He sees her packing, preparing to move out into her own apartment, and he asks her this.
Was there any novel where the heroine gets married to the wrong guy and then realizes it, and then the other suitor shows up, some guy who's always been in love with her, and then they get together? But finally the second suitor realizes that the last thing the woman needs is to get married again, that she's got more important things to do with her life, and so finally the guy doesn't propose at all, even though he still loves her. Is there any book that ends like that? This is my reading of The Marriage Plot. It's an argument by Jeffrey Eugenides that in order for literature to move forward, it must first move past the metafiction and the irony that David Foster Wallace championed, and instead we should look towards the novels of yesteryear, those great sincere books. It's also a shift away from the reflective nostalgia that defined Jeffrey Eugenides' first two books and into a more restorative nostalgia. In order to build back the novel into the future, oh, well, we have to look to the novels of the past because that's when all the best novels were written. Mitchell's Sex with Madeline is, in fact, an embrace of this philosophy through Madeline's embrace of the novel's most nostalgic character. Then, however, Madeline moves on without Mitchell into her own future.
Eugenides, I think, realized it would have been arrogant to suggest that he was the one with the answers as to where literature should go, and so he has Madeline move on without Mitchell to end the novel. But his treatment of everything surrounding the Leonard character is so bitter and so bizarre, it frankly undermines what I think he's trying to do here. Yes, The Marriage Plot is Eugenides' weakest full-length book. I don't think it's a bad book, but it is one that's just kind of average if you read it without any background, and weird as shit if you read it with background. I think it is interesting, however, because it shows so clearly that Eugenides understands how to use nostalgia to sell a concept. After all, nostalgia only really began to change from a literal disease into a wistful feeling thanks to the hard work of marketing executives. Ah, marketing executives. They really do make everything better. 5 books later, here we are. Histories of nostalgia, analyses of nostalgia, and books so deeply steeped in nostalgia, they're having conversations with themselves about it under the guise of classic coming-of-age and love story plots.
I love Eugenides' work. I get so emotionally involved in it, especially when I read Middlesex, which has an ending that chokes me up every time I read it. Even with a lesser work of his, like The Marriage Plot, I got sent into a tailspin when I read that. So I guess what was a big part of me making this video was that I would like you to try to read some Eugenides as well. I'd recommend starting with The Virgin Suicides or Middlesex and just see what you enjoy in either of those books, and then maybe continue from there. The second part of what inspired me to make this video was an attempt to try to understand my own nostalgic impulses. The intense longing that Jeffrey Eugenides so clearly feels for people, places, and times that have since gone by is something that often rings true for me, and I have a suspicion it may ring true for some of you as well. There is this idea of nostalgia. It's an idea that I have struggled with for a long time, and my own nostalgic impulses often pop up and they try to drag me hand over fist back into this imagined past that grows more golden with every step that I take into my own future. Nostalgia is a reaction, right? And reaction without thought is a dangerous thing. The Lisbon sisters killed themselves. Cal spent decades mired in the past, unable to move forward or to better himself as a person. Jeffrey Eugenides wrote 3 books about nostalgia to try and deal with his own, and until he publishes a 4th, how well he's dealt with that nostalgia remains, to me, an open question, as does how well I deal with mine. For my part, I hope this video encourages you to examine your own nostalgia in some ways and maybe read a little Jeffrey Eugenides as well. Thank you for your time.